Hello, Keith. Welcome back to the Wax Museum.
Hey, thank you so much, John. It's exciting. I'm excited to be back. Appreciate you having me back on.
Yeah. How are things going?
You know what? Relatively well.
Hmm.
Things are going good. I'm working right at the moment. I'm finishing up my next book, Jesus Unforsaken, which is going to look at penal substitutionary atonement and just atonement
Mm.
theories in general, the cross. So I'm finalizing, I hope, finalizing that this week. And still working on, I think I mentioned to you, I'm doing some online courses. I just launched this week a brand new course called Ground Zero. And it's doing great. I had like 56 people sign up for that. So that was amazing.
Oh,
So yeah, and it's just kind of helping people go from deconstruction to reconstruction.
wow.
I have these courses called Square One, Square
Hmm.
Two, and Square Three, which I've been going for about a year now. And Ground Zero is sort of like I envisioned it as sort of a pre-Square One. It's like, what's before Square One? Oh, Ground Zero. So,
Mm.
so it's meant to be, Ground Zero is sort of meant to sort of like help people kind of, I guess, to figure out where they're at in the deconstruction journey. And
Yeah.
in my way, what I'm trying to do is also to help them figure out if something like Square One would be helpful for them, or not. So,
Hmm.
but even if it's not, there's going to be a whole lot of great stuff we're going to cover in Ground Zero. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been doing lately. That's my life now. I write books, I do online courses. Um, and since most of all of that is done through my little computer sitting in my little office here, and I don't have to go out, and do anything, it's okay for me that we're going through this pandemic. It
Yeah.
hasn't really affected me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's affected me a bit. Like I have to do work trips to make the company money, but a lot of my work is in office, and so I just work from home for that.
Yeah,
But
that's good.
crazy times. I've got like two kids now in isolation because there were cases of COVID at their school. And so it's
Uh,
like, yeah.
Yikes. Yeah, man, that's
Yeah.
not good.
I was kind of liking having the house to myself, but
Yes, I am.
they're-
I'm kind of an introvert, to be honest. So I don't mind being home alone a little bit.
So the reason why I had you on the Wax Museum to talk about your clickbaity article, I just love how clickbaity it is. The title was "Exposed: The True Dangers of Progressive Christianity."
Yes.
Um, so I think you kind of kick off the article with this idea that progressives rewrote the scriptures
Mm,
and gave the example that the word homosexual was not added to the Bible till 1946. What
yeah.
do you think the original intentions were of passages that these progressives claim to speak on that topic?
So what do I think they're, say that again?
So where the Bible talks about homosexuals, and it's
Right.
like, well, that word was inserted into the Bible. What was
Yes.
the original intention of those passages that these
Yes.
progressives were using to speak against Christianity?
Got it. Yeah. So, yeah, and then the premise, of course, of the whole article is sort of to flip the tables on conservative Christians who accuse, progressive Christians of being, well, these progressives, they're adding to the Bible, they're adding to the
Hmm.
scriptures, they're twisting things to just to fit what they want it to say. So I'm trying to turn the tables because that's kind of exactly what conservative Christians did in these examples that I give in the article. And that
Right.
particular example, I mean, it is true. I mean, it's the truth. If you go and even look at, I mean, I'm not a King James only guy at all. So that's,
Hmm.
please understand what I'm saying. But if you go to one of the earliest English translations of the Bible, the 16 whatever 11 King James Bible, you'll notice that when it comes to these passages, like in 1 Corinthians, it does not use the word homosexual. So it's the truth. The word homosexual did not appear in any English translation of the Bible until like 1946. And when you go and look at the translation sort of team, and I think it was the Revised Standard Version of the Bible that this first happened in. The team that was part of this translation team that for the first time inserted homosexual, and then of course other translations followed suit after. After this, their reasons for doing this were not based on, oh look, you know what, we've looked into the Greek for these particular words that were prior to this not translated homosexual, and we were determined that, you know what, it's more accurate to say homosexual here. That's not why they did it. It was purely a political, hey, we don't like homosexuals, and so hey, it's convenient for us to sort of make the scripture say something about a topic that we want it to say this. Like, so let's just kind of get it to say this. So if you back it up though, I can't remember the article. I think in the article I do go into it a little bit, but I've written many articles on this in the past. So there's two words actually in the Greek, in the First Corinthians passage, that are both translated in English translations homosexual, which is illegitimate. I mean, neither of these words mean homosexual. Certainly not in the way we think of it today. So briefly, the two words are in the Greek. One is malakoi. The other word is arsenokotai. Arsenokotai is a very curious word because it's a compound word that it almost seemed for the longest time that Paul sort of invented this word, because we don't see examples of this word. I mean, Paul just kind of drops it in there, like, what's that word mean? And so, but if you look at some other places there, actually we have found other places where, not in the scriptures, but other people around the first century use similar words, use a similar word. And in those cases, it always referred to pedophilia.
Oh.
Yes. And by the way, if you read one of my favorite New Testament scholars, David Bentley Hart, in his new translation of the New Testament, he has a very lengthy commentary under this passage in 1 Corinthians about the translation of these two words, malakoi and arsenokotai. And he goes into a lot more detail to basically say it's pretty certain that what Paul's referring to here is a first century practice of pedophilia, where men would basically have young boys as sex slaves. I don't know another way to say it. So this is pedophilia. That's arsenokotai. It's not homosexuality the way we think of it, of like two same-sex people who love one another, care about each other, want to spend their lives together, have always felt, both of them mutually having always felt this. Like, it's in other words, it's an abuse. Arsenokotai is an abuse of power, someone abusing power, sexual power over another person who's weak. And this is pedophilia. So that's the first one. And the second one, malakoi, is a little more interesting in that it really is just a word for soft. And previous to the 1946 revision, English translations would translate that as basically effeminate. So now what we need to do to understand what Paul is talking about here, when he, like, what is Paul thinking of when he uses this word malakoi, in his mind of being effeminate? Paul's and other people in the first century, especially first century Jewish mindset, there are certain things that, again, he talks about. He uses this language in 1 Corinthians where he talks about things that are natural, right? So you and I are safe, John, because we have beards. So, but if we shaved our beards off completely and we had smooth faces, that in Paul's mind would be malakoi, because you look like a girl. You're trying to make yourself look like a woman, because women don't have beards, and it's unnatural for a man to have a smooth face like a woman. It's also the reason why Paul says in 1 Corinthians that it's unnatural. It goes against nature for a man to have long hair. Why? Because women have long hair.
Right.
That goes against nature. Now, you and I today would not agree with Paul. We would say, Paul, the guy's got long hair. It doesn't mean he can't go to heaven. It doesn't mean he can't inherit the kingdom. But Paul, in his first century mindset, would say, oh, no, he can't. No, if a man does something against nature, against his nature, and shaves his beard or has long hair or likes music and poetry or any of these things that he would call effeminate, that's against nature, and therefore he can't inherit the kingdom. So that is what Paul is saying. But see, to me, I would put that on the same category as something where Paul says that we should greet one another with a holy kiss, or that women should cover their head when they pray. Those were first century cultural, Jewish cultural, first century cultural things that we read today, and we have no problem saying that was for them. We don't think that way. I don't need to follow that, right? I would. So,
no, I remember one time somebody was jokingly telling me, it's like, you're wearing a hat in church, John. You shouldn't do that. I'm like, I'm wearing a hat so the angels don't lust after me.
Because that is what he says. Yes. But I gotta say, there's an excellent podcast. It's called The Naked Bible,
Uh-huh.
and it's actually a commentary. I think it's even a commentary on this same passage in First Corinthians, where he goes into some pretty wackadoodle science, first century science. It's an excellent research article that was written. It was published in actually, a Greek New Testament sort of scholarship journal, where this guy had done this research about, like in the first century, doctors follow what's called the Hippocratic Oath, right?
Right.
But there's basically a guy, his name was Hippocrates, and Hippocrates, again, this is an ancient, early kind of way of thinking. The science or medicine of the day, published by Hippocrates, they believed that a woman's hair was part of her genitalia, and that her long hair, what it was doing was pulling, now this was their belief, the woman's long hair was pulling semen out from her groin up into her head so that she could have a baby. Now, we know that's not science or medicine. We know that's wackadoodle. That's insane. But Paul believed this. Paul thought this way. And this is why he says some of the things he says in this First Corinthians passage, like the whole thing about women covering their hair, because in his mind, her hair is her genitalia. It's part of her genitalia.
That would make sense.
Yeah. But once you understand these things, it makes a lot more sense. Anyway, but that's the understanding of like how, that's what Paul is really trying to say in these passages, right? He's talking about being effeminate and being or synecdoche. So whereas we might agree with him on the synecdoche thing, like yes, pedophilia, nope, that's not good. We would go, well, come on, Paul. If a guy shaves his beard and likes music and has long hair, he can still enter the kingdom. You know what I mean? But again, these changes were made in 1946 to our English translations of the Bible, and the word homosexual was inserted there when neither one of these are about homosexuality. And again, it's been used ever since to sort of, it's one of those clobber passages. It's been used to this very day to sort of keep homosexual people out of the church. And to bring condemnation upon them. So again, I'm just bringing that up that to me, what's more progressive than that? Let's take a passage of the scriptures, change it to say what we want it to say, when even though it doesn't say that at all, we're just going to make it say that because we prefer it to say that. We need a Bible verse that says that. And then we're going to use that to promote a belief that's a new belief. It's a new doctrine based on, it's not something that was used in that way. And it's certainly not based on that scripture.
Okay, so another thing you address is progressive John Calvin, a notorious progressive,
He's such a progressive.
and his gospel. How does his gospel differ from the real gospel?
Well, see, again, this is a thing where we have to think of it. It's so much about perspective. Like even your statement about John Calvin, he was such a progressive. Well, if you lived in the 1500s, you would say John Calvin was a progressive. He was saying things that were radical. I mean, so Martin Luther was too. I mean, the 95 Thesis was a radical statement. There was nothing more emerging church or progressive Christianity than that at the time. Now we look back on it now because for us that was years, like 1,000 years ago, man. Come on, that was a long time ago, or over 500 years ago. So we think it's old, but at the time it was radical. It was progressive. And that's, again, my point is that Calvin did introduce new ideas. They were progressive ideas for the time. And again, I don't want to necessarily say that new ideas are always bad. I think sometimes people can have new perspectives that are good. I'm open to that. But what I want to point out is that so many Christians today tend to define the gospel as penal substitutionary atonement theory. And I just want to point out that doesn't make any sense. Because if the gospel is penal substitutionary atonement, why did God wait 1,500 years to give us the gospel?
Yeah.
Because that's not, again, Calvin introduced a new idea in his day and age. That was PSA. That was penal substitutionary atonement. That was a new, radical, different idea. He built upon Anselm's idea. and his doctrine of the atonement, but it was still a new idea, and it certainly therefore couldn't be the gospel. So what I maintain is that, and I just even had a debate with somebody about this very topic, because there are Christians today who genuinely do believe if you ask them to explain the gospel, they'll describe the gospel in terms of penal substitutionary atonement theory, and they're basing it more on 1 Corinthians 15 from Paul's writings, rather than what I would say is, to me, this is so simple. If you want to know what the gospel is, maybe we should ask Jesus. And I don't know, this is going to sound really crazy, but there are these 4 books in the New Testament called the Gospels. Maybe in one of those Gospels, Jesus would tell us what the gospel is. By the way, he does. And so the gospel, I would say, doesn't begin with in the 1500s with John Calvin. I think that's ludicrous. And it doesn't even begin with Paul's letter to the Corinthians, like 40 years after Jesus was around. No, it begins with Jesus, and Jesus in the Gospels gives us the gospel, which is the good news of the kingdom. He presents the gospel message. And by the way, it's not a gospel message that Jesus gives us, this good news of the kingdom, the idea that the kingdom of God is here now. Jesus announces the kingdom of God. This is the good news. The kingdom of God is at hand. It's within you. It's close enough to touch. It's within reach. You can enter the kingdom right this second. This is the good news. Well, Paul, there's 9 different examples of Paul in the book of Acts and even in his own epistles, where Paul affirms verbatim the good news, the gospel of the kingdom. So it's not as if Paul goes, yeah, Jesus, that's your thing. I got this other idea, and I'm going to write it down in 1 Corinthians. So Paul is not attempting at all. In fact, I think if anyone would be pissed off at the idea of Christians redefining the gospel as something Paul wrote, it would be Paul. He'd be like, well, what are you guys doing? Time out. I believe the gospel that Jesus preached, and here are 9 examples in the New Testament of me saying exactly that. Don't take this, the other thing I said in 1 Corinthians 15 out of context. That's not the gospel. I do understand what the gospel and the good news of the kingdom are, and I've been preaching it all through my ministry. That's what Paul says. So again, I'm just trying to bring us back. So I think I say this in my article. I'm a regressive Christian.
Yes.
People call me a progressive. I think I'm really a regressive. Let's just go back to Jesus. Get as much as we can back to the original idea, because I think some of these new ideas have been leading us a little bit astray from what Jesus was all about.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, you mentioned early on deconstruction and then reconstruction. And it seems like not enough people talk about what reconstruction is. It's kind of like everybody just kind of deconstructs and then they sit in that for a while. And I've been working on a project right now I call the Reconstruction Project. And it's just music stuff that I'm doing under my other musical name. So I have the Bridge Livwat stuff, but then I have the Johnny Howe music stuff, and I'm trying to write some worship music from a reconstruction point of view. And one of the things I've been wrestling with this whole idea of reconstruction is the first thing that kind of brought me back, to my faith was me focusing on this idea that God is love.
Yes.
And when I see people that are losing their faith, I'm like, well, can you at least seek love? Because I believe God is love and you will find him if you actually seek love.
Yes.
And it's like, and the whole, phrase God is love, it's like there's a noun that's synonymous with God, which is love. And I'm like, that's so powerful. And
Yes.
a lot of more, fundamentalist evangelicals will hear me say that and be like, oh, but God is also just. And I'm like, nope, that's not a synonymous noun.
Right.
And his justice is love. And so, But anyways.
That's a great point. That's a really great point.
Yeah. So basically, that was one of the things I was building on. And then I'm like, what I want to get to is this concept. Well, there's another one where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Again, we've got a case of 3 synonymous nouns. And I'm like, I got to figure out what that means. And when I tell evangelicals that, they're like, oh, it means this. And I'm like, no, I don't want the Sunday school answer.
Right.
I'm looking at this and I want to look at this with fresh eyes. And I'm still kind of stuck on way right now. And I'm like, I don't think way is just like you say the magic words and now you go to heaven. I think that way is actually model my life after Christ.
Yes. So let's have fun with that for a second, because I think
Mhm.
that's was I was started rethinking that exact passage in my book Jesus Unbound, which was looking at the scriptures through the lens of
Mhm.
Christ and seeing that Christ is the Word of God, not the Bible.
Right.
But
Yes.
I went back to that passage, and I think I also talk about this in my book on hell too, because I think it's related. Um, Pretty sure I'm talking about it in both places.
I
Because
love
again,
that I've read all of these.
yeah. So
I'm
so
such a fan.
the you know, the assumption, like you said, the Sunday school answer we've been given, and I was handed, and I just accepted it,
Yeah.
was that when Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me," that what he means is the only way to get to heaven is through Jesus. But I really think if you read the entire chapter and you just follow, in other words, erase your assumptions. Just
Yeah.
pretend you've never read this in your life. You don't know what he's going to say next, because this is what the disciples were do. They're
Yeah.
sitting there going, well, what is he talking about?
Yeah.
So kind of as much as you can have a blank slate and just listen to what he says. The entire progression is, I'm going to the Father. Show us the Father, and that'll be enough. Oh, if you've seen the Father, you've seen me. Now the whole context is the Father and Jesus. Looking at Jesus to see the Father, that's where Jesus is going. If I want to know the Father, I would look at Jesus. And in that context, Jesus says, I am the way to understand the Father. Right? It's not to get. I would say this. This is at least one particular possible way to understand. I don't want to tell you this is the way, but I
Yeah.
started thinking of it as like, what if what he's saying is, oh, we're talking about the Father now. I mentioned the Father. You act like you don't know who the Father is. I'm telling you, if you want to know the Father, you look at me. And so now I'm going to say, so if you want to know the way to the Father, well, look at me. I'm
Yeah.
the best picture of the Father. And again, the New Testament affirms this all over the place. Jesus is the exact representation of the Father. And again, it's not about going to heaven. It's it's a way to know the Father,
And the
right?
Father is love.
And the Father is love.
So it's like
Exactly.
Jesus is the way to love. Like that's
Yes.
cool.
Yes. And
Yeah.
talking again, and that's in the Gospel of John. And then if you go to
Mhm.
First John, which again, I talk about a book that's sort of buried and forgotten, man. I tell you what, I think there's so much mind-blowing truth in this little book of First John. Because in First John, he says, God is love. And here's the real, to me, mind-blowing thing he adds to that. So we always know God is love, but keep
Yeah.
reading. God is love. And then he says, all who live in love live in God, and
Wow.
God lives in them.
Yes.
Whoa, that's different.
Yeah.
That's like, okay, God is love, and if you live in love, God lives in you.
Mhm.
Okay, that's pretty radical. You know what I mean? And so it sort of takes the religious thing off of it. So in other words, like I think what it's suggesting is that you could live in a country, not speak English, never seen a Bible in your life, but you believe there's a God somewhere, and you believe that that when you express love, you're expressing some divine characteristic, or and you're right. And God is in that and in you and in that
Yes.
expression. You are in
Yeah.
God, God is in you, because that's who God is. God is love. It's not about this
Yeah.
religious, say this prayer, read this book. It becomes something much bigger um, than that. You know what I mean? I think to
Yeah.
me, that's very fascinating.
And I feel like a lot of times it was funny because I was talking to a friend about mental health, and he had said that he was going to get some assessments for his like mental illness, and all of his friends are like, no, you just need to know God more and you need to pray more and all this stuff. And I said to him, your friends, their God's not big enough. They think that God can only work through prayer, but in reality, God can work through doctors. He can
Yes.
work through medication. And it's
Yeah.
like, their God's not big enough. And,
Yes.
and it was just funny. That came to me in that conversation. And I'm just like, that's it. So even with what you're saying, people are like, well, isn't just like saying the name of Jesus sufficient? It's like, no, God's bigger than that. And it's
Yep.
like in love, he's in the love. He's in the love between, a mother and her baby, you know, like you can see
Yeah.
him in that. It's like
Yeah.
God is present in everything and everywhere, and you can
Yeah.
find him in
Yes,
those
absolutely.
moments. And that's
Yeah.
how he speaks to us. And when we
Yeah.
confine it to a church or we confine it to a book, it's like we're making God too small.
Yes, absolutely. Christianity has unfortunately tried so hard to brand Jesus. He's ours, you know, and truth is ours, and
Hmm.
salvation is ours. Like it's exclusive club, and unless you know the secret handshake, you can't get these things. But I really don't think that initially, if you go and really, like I said, try to read it with an open mind, um, Jesus isn't trying to create some kind of religion or club. You know what I mean? I think he really is trying to teach us some things that will set us free, right?
Hmm.
I want to stick on this thing about love too, because you just reminded me too about something. And I just this morning, um, I mentioned I was doing this ground zero thing, and this new course I started. And one of the guys we just started it, so this is the first week. And one of the guys in the course made a comment about how um, growing up in the church, his idea of love was the ideas of love that he got from the church were very twisted, right?
Hmm.
It was actually mixed in with like judgment and
Yeah.
and you're a worm and you don't deserve it and it's all these things.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, you know, I think it maps to what you and I are saying about how God is love. And so if you misunderstand God, if you redefine God as something different than love, well then your understanding of love is going to be twisted as well because God is
Yeah.
love. But if you have a clear view of God as love, then you won't get it all twisted. It won't be like, well, but you're a worm and you don't deserve it, and you know all these
Yeah.
kind of condemnations and stuff. Because you'll get it. You'll understand. No. I'm going to start with the idea that God just is love. That's it. Period. God is love.
Yeah.
Everything He does, even if we want to talk about judgment, whatever, you know, like that's the whole threat. I get it all the time. You're a false teacher, Keith. God's gonna judge you. And I'm like, you know what? Awesome. I cannot wait to be judged by perfect love
Mm.
because He is perfect love, and any judgment He makes will be love. It'll be a loving thing. It'll be for my
Wow.
best because He loves me. He's a loving Abba Father, and so I'm not afraid of that. There's no
I
fear in
love
that,
that.
right? Again, First John even says that there is no fear in love
Mm.
because fear is about punishment. Fear is
Yeah.
about judgment. But so he's drawing the line. He's the separation right there. Love isn't about punishment. Love isn't about judgment. So perfect love casts those things out.
Mm.
And so if we have a version of Christianity that's holding on tight to punishment and judgment, John says that's not who God is. That's not the God who is love. That if you live in love, God lives in you and all that. So
Mm.
yeah, it's a pretty fascinating um, way of thinking. I think it's important to rethink some of these assumptions we've been given.
Oh yeah, it's great. And I find even, like in, um, if you ever have that moment with your spouse where you kind of look at them and say, you know what would it be like if I was seeing this person for the first time?
Yeah.
And you try to imagine that, and it kind of breathes like fresh life into your relationship. I'm
Yeah.
like, that's kind of my moment with God sometimes. I'm just like, all right, how can I look at God in a whole new way? How can I receive a new revelation of who He is?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a beautiful thing, and I think we definitely do need to do that. We need to get to this place of being able to see with fresh eyes and recognize that this is about a relationship with God.
Hmm.
The minute it gets to be predictable and boring, and and which can happen. I mean, that though is sort of like I think the sign that what you've really got is some religion. uh,
Yes.
because if it's a relationship, it truly is a connection and a vibrant, breathing, daily connection and relationship with God. Um, I don't think it would really be that way. I think, but it has to be something where you're keeping it new and you're keeping it real and fresh. You're not allowing it to fall into, because religion is about patterns and formulas and I go here, I do this, rituals and things like that.
Yeah.
That's not I think what Jesus is talking about or expects that we would experience with when we're connected or abiding in Him.
Yeah, I always think of it as a cage. People are like, don't put God in a box. And I'm like, I like a cage. I think it's a better analogy because it's like we've caged God, and then anything outside of that cage we don't recognize as God.
Yeah.
And we do the same thing with art. We do the same thing with ideologies. So spirituality, art, and ideologies, we do all of that where we're just like, that's outside the cage. That's not real. And it's like, no, step outside your cage. It's beautiful. God's
Yeah.
bigger than that.
Right. Exactly. He's not contained by any of these things. Exactly.
Okay, so another progressive, John Nelson Darby, brought the new idea of end times rapture. So how is this idea of the rapture harmful?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, yeah, my most recent book is all about that. Yes, so John Nelson Darby introduced this new idea. And again, most Christians don't realize it's a new idea. They think that this is someone. I was talking to someone about this whole thing, about this whole end times, left behind sort of thing that we all kind of grew up with.
Yeah.
About when it comes to the end times, right? So
Yeah.
that idea of the end times, like someone was saying, I just assumed that this was handed to us by the apostles. No, it really wasn't. It really was John Nelson Darby in 1830 came up with this idea of this end times rapture theory. He connected all these dots in the Old Testament prophecies and the New Testament, Revelation and stuff like that, and Daniel and Matthew 24, and sort of created this end times theology, which now, yes, today it's become so commonplace that we think, again, just the way people today think PSA, penal substitution, is the gospel. We also now think that Darby's end times rapture is, again, handed to us by the apostles. The Christian church always believed this, but it didn't. We really didn't. It's only something, again, as recent as 1830. So you asked me the question, like the harm it does. Well, holy moly, how about, is it harmful for us to have endured a couple of 100 years of Christians picking dates for the return of Christ, people selling their homes,
Yeah.
quitting their jobs, living up in the mountains, waiting for Jesus to come back, and then he doesn't. Then they lose their faith. They give up on God completely. They think the whole thing's a joke.
Yeah.
They've shipwrecked their lives. I mean, people
Yeah.
have even killed themselves. They've committed suicide over these kinds of, this kind of hype and this belief that the end is near and all that stuff. So that's one thing. Holy moly, yeah. The human carnage, the lives that have been destroyed over this doctrine is pretty huge. It's definitely hurt the faith. I mean, for people outside of Christianity, we don't even sometimes consider this. But if you're not a Christian, but you've still grown up seeing, billboards or things on the news, the Christians or books, people predicting the end of the world, the return of Christ is going to happen on this date at this time, with the blood moons or blah, blah, blah. And then it comes and goes over and over and over again. Your perception of Christians is that they don't even understand what their own Bible says, because they're constantly confused about what it says about this return of Jesus thing. They've never once gotten it right. That's what they all have in common. All of these end times prophecies, what they all have in common is they're all wrong 100% of the time. And yet, their popularity is not affected in any way. Any one of these guys, Hal Lindsey, John Hagee, any of these end times predictor guys, end times theology guys, biblical prophecy guys, even though they've been wrong every time, they could put out a book tomorrow and sell 1 million copies. The popularity is not impacted in any way. So it's very dangerous, I think, to the faith. I think it harms people within the church. And I think finally, the most pervasive danger, and this is whether you buy into the end times date setting or anything or not. Let's say you're just a nominal believer in this end times, left behind theology. What I think it does is that it creates this sort of holding pattern. Like, we're just waiting for Jesus to come back and fix things. And by the way, it's any day now, very soon. We're closer than we've ever been. It's just probably in your lifetime. So just hang out, buddy. Just keep waiting, keep circling, just keep waiting. And any minute, Jesus is going to come fix it. And I think that mentality, which I think that the church in America largely embraces, this idea of wait for Jesus to come and fix it. What it does is it paralyzes us as the body of Christ from fulfilling our role in the transformation of the culture and the world for the kingdom and for the gospel.
Right. Yes. All right. Eternal conscious torment. That's a fun one. So that's
Yes.
that's another progressive idea.
Yes. That's probably one of the first ones. If we were going to go like chronologically, again, I've written books on this. But again, it's one of these things where until you look into it, you don't know this. And one of my goals, if anything, is just to educate Christians about these kind of things. Like, you don't have to even agree with my assumptions or my
Right.
conclusions, right?
Mm-hmm.
But can I just let you know, and I just try to let Christians know this, Christians who believe in eternal conscious torment, I just try to say, well, hey, did you know? Because if you look at church history, you're going to see this. And I hate to tell you, don't study church history unless you want to rock your boat, have your assumptions challenged. Because if you look at church history, what you'll notice is that from the earliest days of the church history, there have always been three different Christian, biblically based views of what we call hell.
Yeah.
One of those views was eternal conscious torment. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
that's the one we're all familiar with. But there's two other Christian views that all existed together. And the other one was annihilation, and the other view, the third view, was universal reconciliation. Now, the other thing, the other did you know, is that for the first like 400 years of church history, the majority view was universal reconciliation, not eternal torment. In fact, eternal torment was the minority view. And for example, when Augustine, in his day, started to write about his views, because he embraced eternal conscious torment, and when he started to write about his theory, why he believed eternal conscious torment, he even admits it is in the writing. He goes, in this day, there are indeed very many who do not believe this. In fact, believe that all shall be saved.
Right.
So he acknowledges, hey, I'm in the minority here. Most Christians around me today do not embrace eternal conscious torment, but here's why I do. And even when he said that, he actually had so much grace for these other believers. He doesn't attack them. He even says, as he's saying that, he goes, they believe in universal reconciliation without doing injustice to the scriptures. In other words, they believe this because this is how they read the scriptures. He's not even accusing them of adding to the scriptures or twisting the scriptures. He acknowledges, indeed, very many Christians in my day embrace universal reconciliation, and they do so because this is how they read the scriptures. So again, I just want us to understand that eternal conscious torment as the only view of the doctrine of hell is something that didn't come until soon after the time of Augustine. So Augustine helped to popularize this view.
Yeah.
And so now fast forward to today, and it is the only quote unquote Christian view of hell. But that idea, the idea that eternal conscious torment is the only view of hell, that is a new teaching. That is a new idea. If we go back to the beginning, all three views were openly shared. And again, universal reconciliation was the majority view.
Yeah, universal reconciliation. I think originally, when I heard universalism, I thought that it meant like everybody gets a ribbon. Like it's basically the whole thing, right? But it's like when you talk about in your book, you talk about how the fire is meant to purify.
Yes.
It's not a fire to punish.
Yes.
It's a fire to purify.
Yes.
And I know like what I really liked in Rob Bell's book, Love Wins. By the way, your podcast episode with Rob Bell was awesome. He says like, why would someone not just choose God, like when they die and they're kind of in this, whatever it is, purgatory or whatever it is.
In limbo, whatever, yeah.
In limbo, it's like, why would they not just choose God every time? And he's like, there are people that choose hell every day of their lives.
Right.
And I was thinking, and that actually really was revolutionary for me to read that, because I was like thinking, oh man, how many times have I chosen hell in my life? Where it's like somebody does something to me and I'm like, oh, you're going to do this to me? I'm going to show you how crappy my life is because of what you did. And it's like, I'm choosing hell to repay that person for what they did. Like, it makes no sense, right?
Right.
And so I think it makes sense that, the afterlife could be a time of this fire of purification.
Yes.
Because we do need that change.
Exactly. Yeah, so you're right. See, that's the early Christians who embraced universal reconciliation. like you said, they did not teach everybody ollie ollie oxen freeze in, yay, let's, no. It's the opposite, actually. I just tell people, I believe everybody goes to hell. Mother Teresa, Billy Graham, you,
Wow.
me, everybody.
Yeah.
But what I mean is, again, the teaching was that everyone passes through the fire. Jesus says
Mhm.
everyone will be salted with fire. Paul talks about how,
Mm.
we are like, that everyone passes through the fire, and it'll either burn away the things that are not of God and reveal gold and silver and precious stones, or he says, if everything is burned up, there is nothing godly, good, holy in you. He says, yet they shall be saved, but only
Wow.
as those who pass through the fire. So
Mm.
the purpose of the fire, this is the key thing. I could just summarize it in the simplest forms. Whichever of those three views of hell you embrace, we need to recognize that all three views are saying something about the character of God.
Mm.
And we're either saying that we believe God is a torturer,
Yeah.
tortures people forever, his children forever. That God is a destroyer. He annihilates the ones that don't believe in him. He's a destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that for a minute. Is God a destroyer? Or we're saying that God is a loving father who is a healer, who disciplines us for our good. And so again, I think one of the key passages is, we don't typically think of it in this way, is at Hebrews chapter 12, where the author of Hebrews says this: endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is not disciplined by his father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, which by the way means therefore everyone is a son, then you are illegitimate children and not true sons. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live, not die, not be tortured, live? And then in verse 10, our earthly fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, so that we may share in his holiness.
Mm.
So what's that giving us, what the author of Hebrews right there is giving us, is a window into the motivation of the heart of God. Why is God disciplining us? Why is God punishing us? Why are we going through whatever this hell is? Is it to destroy us? No. Is it to just torture us forever? No. Why? It's so that he disciplines us for our good, so that we can share in his holiness. So the purpose of the fire is this purification that reveals, right, something in us, that purifies us to a place that the holiness of God is revealed in us. And so that is, I think, if again, you don't have to agree with it, but at least it's another way of looking at this process.
Totally.
And personally, for me, when you look at all three views, and I do this on my book on the topic, what I think what you see is that the eternal conscious torment of the three views has the weakest arguments. Like, it isn't in the Old Testament. It crept into Judaism, through pagan sources, and even the supposed verses that Jesus is speaking about hell are not at all about that topic at all. So, to me, if you're going to believe any of those three views, I think eternal conscious torment has the weakest legs to stand on. I think it's, there's really no reason to believe it. In fact, I even say it's not in the Bible. I don't think it's taught.
All right, one more question.
Okay.
Can you talk a bit about how progressives have introduced a politically charged form of Christianity and how that has become harmful?
Yeah, well, certainly, yes. That's definitely another twist and addition and redefining of the gospel and of Christianity. I mean, to the point where you could, and gosh, I see this almost on a daily basis. You can't be a Christian if you vote blank.
Yes.
You can't be okay, I'm looking for that in my script, in my New Testament. Where is that? Where does Jesus say you can't be a Christian unless you vote for Pilate, or unless you're, go Caesar 2020? Yeah. Like, what? So why? So again, that is definitely a progressive idea that now you can't be a Christian. You can't follow Jesus. You can't go to heaven, whatever, however they're framing that statement. if you vote this way or that way, like to talk about adding something to the gospel, adding something to Christianity, like that's really screwy.
Yeah.
And so again, I talk about that in my book, Jesus Untangled, this idea that we have so entangled faith and politics, we don't know where one end ends and the other begins.
Mhm.
We're more American than Christian. We're more Republican or Democrat than an ambassador of Christ and his kingdom. And that's super dangerous, I think we could see lots of evidence for that today. People who are not very Christ-like. And this is the thing about entangling our faith with our politics. When we become entangled this way, and we become nationalistic or tribalistic, and start playing this us versus them game, it's not very Christ-like.
No, and I mean, like, and I'm Canadian, and so I think what's been really interesting is like how kind of, the polarization that happened, from the 2016 election kind of forward, I think is where it really became obvious. And, there are Canadians that are just like wanting to speak about American politics all the time. And I'm like, why are you going out of your way to alienate people? Like, I don't understand.
Yes. Yeah, and I wrote a blog post this week about this because I just, my heart is broken when I see the, because in my country, of course, even specifically in the church, how this has created such a division in the body of Christ. And we're playing this game of you can't be a Christian if you voted for this guy or that guy. And it's just gotten worse now after this election, after 4 years of Trump, and now this election process, which again is more volatile and scary. I just wrote a blog post about this just to say, we've got to remember that we're all human beings, because I think that what starts to happen when we play this us and them kind of game, this tribalistic Republican, Democrat, us versus them kind of game, and especially within the church. But we start forgetting that those other people who vote differently than we do are human beings. That we need to get back to what unites us, what makes us one.
Yep.
Because the things that make us one, the things that connect us and unite us, are much stronger. And honestly, they're actually real.
Yes.
Other stuff isn't really real. We just invented these ideas and decided, well, this is a Republican idea, this is a Democrat idea. And if no, they're just ideas, and we're just people. And we all love our kids, and we all love music and poetry and movies and food. And we love, walking in nature. Like, these are the things, and this is what makes us human.
Yes.
And we have to get back to the things that make us human and that make us one, and that allow us to see on the other side of the table another human being. Because the demonization that comes through the tribalism, it's so dangerous.
Yep.
It enables us to not just hate someone, but if we're not careful, it can empower us to justify doing some harm to that other person, because we have dehumanized them to such a degree. And really, why? Only because they disagree with us on this policy or that politician or something. It's just really scary.
It is. It is. Well, thank you, Keith.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. This is fun. I'm glad we had a chance to have this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
Air Smudge.